For almost 50 years, everything we knew about the death of Elvis Presley seemed fragmented. Contradictory reports, sealed documents, witnesses who changed their stories, and a funeral that left fans deeply unsettled. But today, in an investigation nobody thought would advance, a forgotten letter written in Elvis's final days has finally been found. A letter he tried to send, but never reached its destination. A letter that speaks of fear, of love, of regrets, and of a secret that the family never publicly acknowledged. And when the investigators read the recipient's name, the ground simply disappeared beneath them. Now I ask you, what would you do if you discovered that everything you believed about Elvis, even about his own family, was about to change? The investigation began not with fanfare or dramatic headlines, but with a simple request from a documentary team working on a comprehensive retrospective about Elvis Presley's final year. They'd filed dozens of routine records requests, hoping to uncover minor details that might add texture to their project. Performance schedules, medical receipts, perhaps some candid photographs that had never been published. What they didn't expect was for one of those requests to unlock something that had been sealed away for nearly 5 decades. A team of archival investigators was tasked with reviewing forgotten files related to the events of August 1977, specifically examining inconsistencies that had plagued the historical record since Elvis's death. Over the years, fans and researchers had pointed to numerous contradictions in official accounts. Discrepancies in timelines, conflicting witness statements, unexplained gaps in documentation. Most had been dismissed as the natural chaos that surrounds any major celebrity death, but some questions had never been adequately answered. In early 2024, a significant breakthrough occurred. A box of private family documents, maintained in strict confidentiality for decades, was partially released as part of a legal settlement involving estate matters. The archivists weren't expecting much. Probably some financial records, maybe a few personal receipts or mundane correspondence. Instead, buried beneath layers of manila folders containing contracts and tax documents, they found something that made everyone in the room stop breathing. An envelope. Yellowed with age, its edges soft and fragile from years of storage. But what made it extraordinary wasn't its condition. It was the fact that it had never been registered in any official catalogue, never been logged or documented. It existed in a kind of administrative limbo, as if someone had deliberately kept it off the books. The envelope was sealed with old wax, the kind you don't see anymore, pressed with what appeared to be a personal signet. The address was written in flowing handwriting that several members of the team recognized immediately, though they didn't want to say it aloud until they were certain. They brought in forensic document examiners who compared the handwriting to verified samples from Elvis's personal correspondence. The analysis took 3 days. When the results came back, they were unequivocal. The handwriting matched perfectly. Every loop, every slant, every pressure point was consistent with Elvis Presley's distinctive style. This was his letter, written by his hand, but never sent. The discovery immediately reignited decades-old suspicions about Elvis's final days. Why had he seemed so restless, so troubled in those last weeks? Multiple witnesses had described his behavior as erratic, sometimes energized and optimistic, other times withdrawn and deeply melancholic. The Memphis Mafia, his inner circle of friends and bodyguards, had given conflicting accounts over the years about his state of mind. As the investigation deepened, they began cross-referencing the letter's existence with other documentation. A housekeeper at Graceland mentioned in a 1978 deposition that she'd seen Elvis frantically trying to make phone calls late at night during his final week. She'd heard him arguing with someone, though she couldn't make out the words. That testimony had been buried in thousands of pages of legal documents and largely forgotten. Security logs showed unusual activity. Elvis requesting that certain calls be placed through private lines rather than the main switchboard, something he rarely did. Phone records that still existed showed incomplete call attempts to numbers that had never been traced. The conflicting versions of his final morning began to make more sense in this new context. Some people remembered him as animated, joking with staff, planning future projects. Others recalled him as profoundly disturbed, speaking cryptically about unfinished business, about things he needed to make right before it was too late. The central question that emerged from all of this was simple but devastating. What did Elvis need to say, and to whom, before he died? What was so urgent, so important, that he'd written a letter in his final days, but somehow never managed to send it? The envelope sat on the examination table, still sealed, holding answers that might finally explain some of the mysteries that had haunted Elvis's legacy for half a century. And on the front, barely visible through the aged paper, were two initials that would change everything: C.T. The decision to open the letter wasn't made lightly. The team debated for hours. Should they wait for additional authorization from the estate? Should they document every step with multiple cameras? Should family members be present? In the end, they proceeded with extreme caution. A conservation specialist wearing white gloves carefully heated the wax seal just enough to soften it without damaging the paper beneath. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of breathing and the barely audible crackle of old wax giving way. When the envelope finally opened, revealing several pages of handwritten text on personal stationery, one of the researchers had to sit down. The handwriting was unmistakable, but what struck everyone immediately was how different it looked from his usual correspondence. The letters were less confident, more hurried, as if written by someone racing against time or struggling with trembling hands. The letter began without preamble, diving immediately into confession. "I don't know if these words will ever reach you, but I have to write them. I have to try, because if I don't, and something happens, you'll never know the truth. And that's a weight I can't carry into whatever comes next." The vulnerability in those opening lines was startling. This wasn't the Elvis the world knew, confident, charismatic, larger than life. This was someone stripped of all pretense, writing in the desperate hope of being understood. He wrote about sleepless nights, about lying awake in Graceland while the world assumed he was living a dream. He described the crushing pressure of fame as something that had slowly hollowed him out from the inside, leaving only the performance, only the image, while the real person withered in darkness. "Nobody in this house understands what I carry," he wrote. "They see the mansion, the cars, the success. They don't see the cage. They don't see how being Elvis Presley became a prison I built myself, brick by brick, and now I can't find the way out." The letter suggested secrets that extended beyond personal struggles, tensions and truths that had been deliberately kept quiet within the family. He referenced things that had been sealed in silence, a phrase that investigators found particularly significant given the decades of sealed records and NDAs that surrounded his death. Then came the apologies, page after page of them, each more heart-rending than the last. He asked for forgiveness for failures that were never properly explained to the public, though he didn't specify what those failures were. He mentioned regrets about a love from his past, someone significant whose name he didn't write, but whose memory clearly haunted him. The language suggested someone he'd left behind or been separated from by circumstances he couldn't control. "There are nights," he wrote, "when I think about the different person I could have been, the different choices I could have made. But by the time I understood what mattered, the machine was already moving too fast to stop." The most devastating passages dealt with his fear of legacy, not the musical legacy, but the human one. He was terrified of being remembered only as a myth, as an icon, as the king, rather than as a man who'd struggled, who'd loved, who'd failed and kept trying anyway. "I wanted to be a better father," he wrote. the words underlined twice as if emphasizing the urgency of the confession. I wanted to be a better son. I wanted to be more human and less performance. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be anything except what people expected. He referenced what they've kept in the silence, a phrase that investigators immediately connected to long-standing mysteries about his funeral, about decisions made by those closest to him, about information that never became public. Was he talking about his health, about family dynamics, about relationships that had been hidden? The letter made clear that in his final days, he'd been attempting reconciliation with someone important. He'd been trying to bridge a gap, to repair something broken, to reach across time and distance to someone who mattered more than he'd ever publicly acknowledged. The final lines of the letter were simple but devastating. If this message reaches you, and know that I tried to be better, I tried to make things right, I tried to find the courage to say what needed to be said before it was too late. If you're reading this, then maybe I failed, but at least you'll know I didn't stop trying until the very end. The room remained silent long after the conservation specialist carefully laid the final page back down on the examination table. Several members of the team were crying openly. They'd expected a historical document. What they'd found was a human soul laid bare, vulnerable and afraid, reaching across decades to tell a truth that had been buried with him. But the most important question still remained. Who was C.T.? The envelope provided the first clue, but it was maddeningly cryptic. 2 initials written in Elvis's careful hand. C.T. The investigative team immediately began compiling lists. Who in Elvis's circle had those initials? They started with the obvious candidates, people who'd been documented as part of his life during the 1970s. The first name that came up was Charlie Trent, a session musician who'd worked with Elvis on several recordings. But documentation showed that Charlie had been touring in Europe during the time the letter was written, making it unlikely Elvis would have been trying to reach him with such urgency. Moreover, the emotional tone of the letter didn't match the professional relationship they'd shared. The second possibility was Catherine Torres, a woman who'd worked briefly at Graceland in the early 70s. Some researchers thought perhaps there had been a romantic connection, but deep dives into employment records and cross-referencing with Elvis's known whereabouts during her tenure revealed only sporadic, professional interactions. Nothing that would warrant the devastating confessions in the letter. The third candidate was Carl Thompson, a distant cousin on his mother's side. But Carl had died in 1975, 2 years before the letter was written, eliminating him entirely. 3 possibilities, 3 dead ends. The investigation seemed to stall until one researcher suggested a different approach. Instead of focusing on who C.T. was, what if they focused on what Elvis was trying to do in his final days? What were his movements, his financial transactions, his phone calls? They began pulling every available record from June through August 1977, bank statements that had been sealed in estate documents, phone logs from Graceland, security records showing who came and went, testimony from staff members that had been buried in depositions from decades-old lawsuits. A pattern began to emerge. In late July 1977, just weeks before his death, Elvis had instructed his financial manager to arrange a private transfer of funds. Not a large sum by Elvis's standards, but significant, $50,000. The unusual part was his insistence that it be handled discreetly, through channels that wouldn't appear in regular accounting. When pressed by his manager about the purpose, Elvis had been evasive. "It's personal," he'd said, "something I should have done a long time ago. Something I need to make right." The transfer was never completed. Elvis died before the paperwork could be finalized. But where had the money been meant to go? The investigators traced the incomplete documentation and found a partial address, a location in a small town in the south, far from Memphis, far from any of Elvis's usual haunts. Then they found the housekeeper's testimony again, the one that had mentioned Elvis making frantic phone calls, she'd remembered one detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. She'd heard Elvis say the name Thompson during one of those late-night calls. She hadn't thought much of it because Thompson was such a common name. But now, combined with the initials CT and the attempted financial transfer, that name took on new significance. The researchers began investigating the Thompson family tree, looking for connections to Elvis's past. They discovered something that had been the subject of rumors for years, but never officially confirmed. A woman Elvis had been involved with in the early 1970s, someone he'd known before she got pregnant and gave birth to a son. That son's name was Chewy Thompson. The timeline was stunning. Chewy had been born in the early 70s, right around the time Elvis's behavior had shifted, according to some witnesses. Several members of the Memphis Mafia later recalled Elvis becoming more withdrawn, more troubled by something he wouldn't discuss. The letter made sudden, heartbreaking sense. When Elvis wrote about the boy I never met but always felt, he wasn't being metaphorical. When he mentioned a life I left behind that nobody had the courage to tell me about, he was talking about a grandson he'd never been allowed to acknowledge. The phrase, "the weight nobody in this house understands," took on new meaning. Elvis believed, or had discovered, that he had a grandchild, a bloodline connection that the family had either hidden from him or refused to help him address. The initial C matched. The surname T matched. The desperate tone of the letter, the urgency, the regret. It all aligned with someone trying to reach out to a family member they'd been separated from by circumstances, by secrets, by the crushing machinery of fame and family control. The investigators cross-referenced the timing with later developments. Decades after Elvis's death, DNA testing would eventually confirm connections that had long been suspected. The existence of descendants who carried Elvis's genetic legacy but had been excluded from official recognition. The conclusion was inescapable. The letter had been intended for the grandson Elvis never got to know, the child of a relationship that had been buried, denied, or hidden away to protect the carefully managed image of the king of rock and roll. Elvis had tried to reach Chewy Thompson in his final days. He'd tried to send money, to write a letter, to make amends for an absence that perhaps hadn't even been his choice. But the letter never arrived, the money never transferred, and Elvis died, carrying the weight of one more relationship he couldn't repair, one more connection severed by the price of being Elvis Presley. The moment the investigation's findings were made public, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, major news outlets were running breaking news segments. Social media exploded with theories, debates, and emotional reactions from fans who'd spent decades defending Elvis's legacy. The Presley estate was contacted for comment. Their response was carefully worded and frustratingly vague. "We are aware of the documents that have surfaced. The family's priority has always been protecting Elvis's dignity and legacy. We have no additional comment at this time." But that non-answer only fueled more questions. Why wouldn't they simply deny the letter's authenticity if it wasn't real? Why wouldn't they clarify the identity of CT if the investigators had gotten it wrong? The silence felt deliberate, calculated, and deeply suspicious to those who'd been following the story. The letter's discovery had an unexpected consequence. It caused decades-old inconsistencies to resurface with renewed intensity. Suddenly, all the strange details surrounding Elvis's death and funeral, details that had been dismissed or explained away, began to look different in light of this new evidence. Fans and independent researchers began compiling lists of anomalies that had never been adequately addressed. The way Elvis's body had appeared in the casket, with some witnesses describing it as looking artificial, almost like a wax figure rather than a real person. The unusual decision to have the funeral so quickly, giving many people barely any time to say goodbye. The mysterious reports that the casket had been secretly reopened after the public viewing, with no official explanation ever provided. Most significantly, people remembered that Elvis's medical records had been sealed for 50 years, an extraordinarily long time that suggested there was something in those documents the family didn't want revealed. Those records weren't scheduled to be unsealed until 2027, a full half-century after his death. The letter seemed to suggest that Elvis had wanted to reveal something before he died, something important enough to risk the carefully controlled narrative around his life. Had he been prevented from doing so? Had family members or handlers stopped him from sending the letter, from making the phone calls, from completing the financial transfer? The name CT and its apparent connection to Chewy Thompson reignited a debate that had simmered for years. The question of hidden heirs and secret descendants. Elvis's romantic life had been the subject of endless speculation, with numerous women claiming connections over the decades. Most had been dismissed. But now, with DNA testing readily available and this letter providing potential corroboration, old claims were being reassessed. The media coverage was relentless. Entertainment news shows ran segments comparing the letter's contents to DNA results that had emerged decades later, confirming biological connections that the Presley estate had never officially acknowledged. Legal experts weighed in on whether the letter could impact inheritance claims. Biographers announced plans to revise their books in light of this new information. The fan community split into factions. Some believed wholeheartedly that this proved decades of cover-up, that the family had systematically hidden truths about Elvis's life and death to maintain control over his image and estate. They pointed to the sealed medical records, the quick funeral, the strange appearance of the body, and now this unsent letter as evidence of a pattern of concealment. Others pushed back, arguing that the letter, if authentic, showed only that Elvis was struggling emotionally in his final days, perhaps confused or paranoid, not necessarily that his beliefs were accurate. They suggested that the family's silence was meant to protect everyone involved from sensationalism, not to hide wrongdoing. Academic researchers and Elvis historians were more measured in their assessments, but even they acknowledged that the letter was significant. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a professor who'd written extensively about Elvis's cultural impact, told reporters, "This document, if verified, fundamentally changes the narrative of Elvis's final weeks. It suggests he died not just physically declining, but emotionally desperate to address unfinished business. That adds a layer of tragedy we didn't fully appreciate before." Music journalist and biographer David Chen went further. "For 50 years, we've told ourselves a relatively simple story about Elvis's death. A talented man destroyed by fame, prescription drugs, and poor health choices. But this letter suggests something more complex. A man trapped by his own mythology, unable to live authentically, unable to acknowledge his own family connections, dying while trying desperately to make amends for choices that may not have even been his to make." D. The most haunting aspect of the letter, the part that resonated with fans and critics alike, was the evidence it provided of Elvis's deepest fear, that he would die without repairing his greatest mistake, without reaching the people who mattered most, without breaking free from the cage his fame had constructed around him. And the question that nobody could answer, the one that hung over every discussion, every news segment, every online debate, was this: why was the letter never sent? Who stopped it? And what else might have been prevented in Elvis's final days? In the weeks and months following the letter's discovery, something unexpected happened. Beyond the media frenzy, Beyond the legal debates and estate disputes, beyond the conspiracy theories and academic analyses, the letter began to do something more profound. It humanized Elvis Presley in a way that no previous document ever had. For half a century, the story of Elvis's death had been dominated by tabloid narratives, the drug abuse, the weight gain, the decline from greatness. He'd been reduced to a cautionary tale, a tragic figure whose ending seemed inevitable, almost deserved. The narrative had become, he had everything and threw it all away. But this letter revealed something entirely different. It showed a man acutely aware of what he'd lost, desperately trying in his final days to repair relationships, to acknowledge connections, to break free from the machinery that had consumed his humanity. His last days weren't just about physical decline. They were marked by emotional desperation, by the urgent need to make things right before time ran out. The references to a possible grandson, to family connections that had never been officially recognized, transformed the story from one of self-destruction to one of institutional control. It suggested that Elvis's inability to live authentically wasn't entirely his own fault, that the people and systems around him had actively prevented him from acknowledging his own family, from living according to his own values, from being anything other than the king. For his fans, the letter became the missing piece of a puzzle they'd been trying to solve for 47 years. All the contradictions, all the strange details, all the sealed documents and hurried decisions, they now had a context. Elvis had been trying to break free, trying to tell truth, trying to connect with people who mattered, and something or someone had stopped him. The letter's existence validated what many had felt instinctively, that there was more to Elvis's death than the official story suggested, that important truths had been buried along with him. Historians began calling it the most intimate document ever associated with the Elvis mythology. Unlike stage performances or carefully managed interviews, this was Elvis speaking without filter, without performance, without the need to maintain any image. It was raw confession, the voice of someone who knew time was running out and desperately needed to be heard. For investigators and researchers focused on the physical mysteries of his death, the letter opened new avenues of inquiry. If Elvis had been prevented from sending this letter, from making phone calls, from completing financial transfers, who had that kind of control? Who benefited from maintaining silence? The contradictions about the funeral, about the appearance of the body, about the sealed casket being reopened. All of it needed to be re-examined in light of someone actively trying to suppress Elvis's final wishes. For the Presley family, the letter represented something more complicated. A potential threat to decades of carefully managed narrative, but also possibly a revelation that might explain behaviors and decisions that had never made complete sense. Were family members protecting Elvis? Or were they protecting the estate? Were they honoring his wishes or overriding them? The public response evolved over time. Initial shock gave way to deeper reflection. People began asking different questions. What does it mean that one of the most famous people in history died feeling unable to acknowledge his own family? What does it say about fame that it can imprison someone so completely that they can't even send a simple letter? Elvis's final phrase in the letter, "If I go before I can say it, please understand me," became a rallying cry for those who felt he'd been misunderstood in life and in death. It appeared on memorial websites, in fan forums, on tribute videos. It was the voice of someone pleading not to be reduced to headlines and mythology, begging to be seen as fully human. The letter didn't answer all the questions. If anything, it created more. But what it definitively accomplished was this. It proved that Elvis Presley's final days were not just about physical deterioration or pharmaceutical dependence. They were about a desperate attempt to reclaim authenticity, to acknowledge love and family, to break free from the golden cage that fame had constructed. Whether Elvis was trying to reach a grandson he'd never met, to reconcile with lost love, to confess secrets the family had kept buried, or all of these things, the letter made clear that he died carrying unfinished business that weighed more heavily on him than any physical ailment. The most painful realization for those who loved him was simple. Elvis Presley died still trying to be heard, still trying to connect, still reaching across the distance that fame had created between himself and the people who mattered most. And the question that will likely never be fully answered, the one that haunts everyone who reads that letter, is this: did Elvis try to ask for forgiveness before he died? And if so, who was he trying to protect by keeping silent for so long? The letter ends where it began, with Elvis's voice, vulnerable and afraid, reaching through decades. Please understand me. Perhaps finally we're beginning to.